Venkat, thanks very much for spending some time with us here in Seattle. I got introduced to you by Mark Hart. Mark is one of these people I go to and say, right, who's the most interesting person I was to speak to? He said, right, you've got to speak to Venkat. So here we are. And I thought we talk through, because you do some interesting things. I'd love you to talk through a bit of your background and what you do, and then we can dig into some of the themes and chat around them.
Yeah. Well, delighted to be here. Thanks for having me on the show. By way of background, I started out in traditional academic R&D. I have a PhD in aerospace engineering, University of Michigan. Spent a couple of years at Cornell doing postdoctoral work on Air Force command and control systems, that kind of thing. So after that, I spent about 4 years in Xerox's Rochester lab doing. I started in the print hardware group, quickly realized that print didn't have much of a future. So found a way to get myself into the web technology area and did a couple of very interesting web technology projects. And along the way, I had started my blog, Ribbon Farm, in 2007. And somewhere around 2009, I had a couple of hit articles that kind of put the blog on the map. And by 2011, when I decided to quit Xerox, the blog had become kind of a viable platform to start a consulting business. So for the last 5 years, I've been basically a consultant working with executives and investors, mainly in the tech sector. And it's been a wild ride. It's all the work is very varied. I get to spend a lot of time just sitting and thinking and writing, which is what I love to do the most.
And so the consultancy work, what kind of projects do you work on for people? Because there's a whole wide variety of people. I mean, Mark Hart's a hedge fund guy, for example.
So it's been varied since it's just me. But one thing I realized early on is that a lot of what the old economy thinks of as consulting. It comes in a couple of different varieties. One is what you might call, CYA, paper trail laying, where you kind of have like big consulting firms coming in, laying down justifications for business decisions that have already been taken. That didn't interest me. I kind of experimented a little bit. Then there's stuff like analyst reports, where you look at something like, say, big data as a trend emerging, and then you write like a big research report. But I realized at some point that when you're working with senior executives and decision makers, it's not so much that they need more input or more thoughtful analysis to read, because that's like, there's plenty of that. There's both good and bad, and the amount of good analysis is just increasing exponentially, and a lot of it is like free or cheap. You no longer have to pay huge dollars to get like business intelligence, and so that part of the consulting game has changed significantly. But what I found was really valuable to the executives I worked with is to have somebody to really just think with. So not so much what to think about, but how to think with. And I think of myself as something like a sparring partner, right? Where you've got like other people who work with executives in a capacity of like a business coach or almost a life coach. I don't have enough empathy to do that kind of stuff. I'm not a therapist in disguise, but what I do like is a really good, no holes barred, punchy conversation on something. And it's like when you're able to think through complicated things that are going on in the world with somebody else, that turns out to be really valuable. And that's the kind of work I like to do the best. So right now, I would say most of my work is in this sparring partner mode, where I work with senior people on just sitting down and talking with them about things they need to process.
And some of your thoughts come out in the Breaking Smart blog site as well that you've got. It's more commercially aware, I guess, than Ribbon Farm is.
Yeah, Ribbon Farm, I would say, is much more of like a cryptic subcultural thing, and there's almost like a deliberate barrier to entry, where if you can't like slog your way through several thousand-word articles of like cryptic insider references, you're not going to get past the firewall of subcultural conceit. But Breaking Smart, that came out of a year of work with Andreessen Horowitz, and it was exploring their software is eating the world thesis. A lot of it through conversations with Mark Andreessen, Ben Horowitz, and all the other smart people there. So that when we were done, we felt this is like really valuable stuff of broad interest. So they very kindly gave me permission to publish some of the findings in those essays. So that turned out to be a very interesting project, and that's how I ended up meeting Mark Hart.
Yeah, I mean, I've read the stuff, and I was flying on the plane over from the Cayman Islands, and I binge read. You said in it, it's for binge reading, and it is binge reading. And when you read it, it's fascinating. It covers tons of different topics, but there's a consistent thread that runs through it. One of the things that I've been interested in, and Mark's been really at the forefront of this for me, is understanding the differences in what's going on in the West versus the East in terms of the US. Not as an Eastern philosophy, but we're just talking about how Wall Street used to be the smartest people in the world. And it sucked in all the scientists, it sucked in all the mathematicians, brought everybody there, and thought was coming into applied businesses, derivatives or whatever it may be. Suddenly, the world has changed entirely. They've been left so far behind because the thought process of what's going on in the west coast of America is extraordinary, I think.
I often respond to that particular thought because it's sort of a thought out there. A lot of people bring that up. I would say actually that in terms of smarts, the West hasn't actually pulled ahead much. Like the East Coast still has extraordinarily smart people, as smart as anybody you find on the West Coast. Like Boston is like a science and technology hub of a particular sort. I think what sets the Western coast of the US apart is sort of a true willingness to take serious risks. So they're bold thinkers. They're not necessarily better thinkers, but they're truly bolder thinkers. And there's a certain sort of strong, this might almost be a reactionary thing, but there's a strong aversion to bullshit. So a lot of the intelligence on the East Coast, it gets devoted to manufacturing like extraordinarily complicated facades of bullshit to preserve certain establishment status quos. And there's very little patience for that on the West Coast. Yes, the West Coast does have its own hypocrisies and its own sort of emerging things.
The East Coast thinks that the West Coast is all bullshit as well, because of everything from meditation to businesses that have no revenues, and they all think it's all hubris, which is something you talked about before. While I don't think it is. I think the more I spend time looking at it, I think it's much more serious what's going on here. It's having, not for a long time, many generations have we had people with a bold vision of a future, and they go and try and execute for that future. I think it's fascinating.
So there is some justice to the East Coast perception of California in particular as, a whole range of like new age bullshit, no revenue companies, wild-eyed thinking. But here's the key thing to remember about the West Coast. It's much less of a unified single edifice of intellectual culture compared to the East Coast. So the East Coast is, in a sense, you can sense a consolidated intellectual culture across Boston, DC. I've lived in DC for a few years. So Boston, DC, New York, there's sort of a convergence in how they think. Whereas the West Coast, you've got like crazy-eyed libertarians, you've got like old California counterculturalists, you've got Burning Man types, you've got like staunch environmentalists, you've got like really hard-nosed capitalists, you've got very self-effacing people who come from the Midwest. So a lot of the semiconductor revolution was started by these people. So these people are very self-effacing, retreating in the background. Plus you've got sort of very flamboyant people who are much more California in the classic sense. So there's a much greater diversity in intellectual cultures. And within that diversity, there are threads that are really bold and really honest and grounded in sort of some sense of, some sense of reality, whether it's the physics of semiconductors, whether it's the behavior of massive crowds on Twitter. There's like a true reality check loop driving certain parts of Silicon Valley. And certain things, yes, there's an actual divergence in belief. Like you just mentioned businesses with no revenue and just focusing on eyeballs. This is actually a case where we can safely argue the East Coast was wrong. Like back in 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst, a lot of people focused on exactly that, like no revenue eyeball businesses. But as it turned out, one of the most valuable companies now, like Google, Facebook, they're eyeball-based companies, right? So there's depth to the idea that just having large masses of attention on your platform is in and of itself a valuable thing. There's actually deep thinking behind that. It's not trivial thinking.
Yeah, and I think the whole structure of business models here are different, and people are keen to try different ways of doing things. I think that's a really unique factor that's going on in the Valley. You know, that conglomeration of smart people in the East have tended to repeat the same processes that have been repeated in the past.
Yes.
Well, here it's much more frontier-like. I mean, almost anything is triable.
Exactly. This has actually been one of my own personal mindset shifts, because I'm trained as an engineer. I have 3 degrees in it, but I'm kind of steeped in the old academia way of thinking about technology. And time and again, in the last 5-6 years, especially as I've done work with technology companies, at some point somebody will encounter a problem where my immediate reaction will be, oh, there's like a huge literature on this, or there's a shelf full of management books on this, or there's a playbook for this. And then invariably the pushback is that they don't want to actually go, rerun the old playbook. And this sort of willingness to sort of throw away old playbooks and re-examine the fundamental assumptions, that's a very powerful thing. Because even though when it fails, people will point fingers at you and laugh at, haha, you ignored 50 years of wisdom and therefore you failed in predictable ways, so we are superior to you. When it succeeds, it breaks assumptions and creates such massive amounts of new wealth that it kind of shuts everybody else up on all the failures. So I think there's true value to this sort of willingness to re-examine and reinvent everything, even if there's like a weight of like hundreds of years of tradition behind it. It's sort of this irreverence towards the past and this belief that they can, rethink and reinvent from the ground up.
Yeah, we did the same when we started Real Vision. We've got our corporate logo internally. That's not an external logo. It's we know fuck about fuck. Because we came into the media business knowing absolutely nothing, and we found it was our biggest strength. That we didn't have to do what the television industry had been doing. Mm-hmm. And we suddenly learned it's in those borders where all the nuance is. And I think Silicon Valley's been fantastic at just saying, well, forget what we know.
Exactly. And this is like going back to the earlier thread we were pulling on. It's not that East and West Coast, there's a difference in smarts. It's that their values of what's sacred and what's profane are almost switched around. It's like on the East Coast, you're really smart if you learn the playbook and can run it better than anybody else. On the West Coast, you're really smart if you can like take a look at the playbook, find its central assumption that's being undermined, then rebuild the entire playbook based on a revised assumption. So the smarts are applied in different ways. So things like, being a credentialist, being like really good at running the playbook, that's sacred in the East Coast and sort of profane. You're almost like looked down upon if you're a stickler for the playbook on the West Coast, if you're willing to hack. So one of the questions on the Y Combinator interview, so Y Combinator is a major incubator in San Francisco, or the Bay Area rather. And one of their questions is, have you ever in your life hacked something for your own ends? And I think that's not so much about intelligence as it is about boldness and attitude and a sort of polar shift in values.
So what is that hacking culture? What is that all about? Because again, it doesn't exist elsewhere. So it's started to permeate other people's thought processes.
I would contest that. I would say it exists everywhere, and it is in fact the natural state of human thinking to hack. And what is in fact anomalous is about, 80 years of children being put in like these prison-like march in lockstep, glorified childcare facilities that we call schools. And this sort of hacker sensibility, which is very natural to children, has been sort of almost squeezed out of them systematically by a machine that's designed to, turn them into interchangeable parts for the industrial era machine. And really there is no sort of magic. It's almost ironic to think of like a playbook to learn hacking. That's meaningless, right? It's almost like what you should stop doing in order to let the hacker personality emerge. Because children naturally kind of are curious. They will look at something, they'll pull toys apart. The hacker sensibility is natural. And as kids grow up, a sort of ethics and a morality gets overlaid on top. But fundamentally, it's about having the instincts about, is what I'm doing the right thing? Is it worth doing? Is this something I should be doing? This door is locked. Do I need to go ask for permission to open it or not? Or do I have my own, internal ethical justification for cracking open that lock, right? And we've seen sort of both the bright and dark side of hacker culture, and we're in sort of a political environment now where an outfit like WikiLeaks or Anonymous, they're like major political players, but they're morally ambiguous. And this tells us that, okay, backing up, the way I would put it is, hacking is almost the belief that agency precedes ethics. It's like, first figure out how to get agency, how to get power and control to do things, then talk about the politics and ethics of it. And that's almost sort of where Silicon Valley starts.
Do you think this is to do with, I don't know if you're familiar with Neil Howe and the Fourth Turning, Strauss Howe?
No, not.
They look
Oh,
at
yeah, of course, the generational models, yes.
Yeah. Do you not think it's part of that? When I look at Silicon Valley, I kind of feel that that process of change from the Fourth Turning is very prevalent in the West Coast attitude, the hacking culture. It seems to be part of a generational thing too, the rejection of what went before.
That's one question that I think a little bit about, because by the Strauss-Howe cycle, the millennial generation, which, oh God, that's become such a term of...
Yeah, it's tiring.
Anyway, but within like the more narrow Strauss-Howe model, millennials are like the greatest generation. So the last generation that was like them is the greatest generation that won World War II and turned into institution builders right after that, right? They built the big companies of the post-World War II era. They did the Marshall Plan in Europe. So they're fundamentally institution builders by sort of psychology. And that's because if your sort of coming of age consciousness forming events are all centered around things falling apart, it doesn't matter what your temperament is, you will want to rebuild as sort of part of your core. Like I'm Generation X, and for us it was like, the events of the 80s, the fall of the wall, it was more like the tail end of decline. Whereas for millennials, it's been, well, on the one hand, the internet has been a massively empowering thing for them. So they feel a huge sense of their own agency, their ability to hack, and sort of almost a vast territory where traditional ethics haven't even been extended. Like nobody really knows what good or bad means on the internet, really. We're just beginning to find out. So that's on the sort of agency side of what the millennials have discovered for themselves. The power to shape reality in sort of a wilderness where societal norms haven't yet extended. But on the other hand, their coming of age events have also included, well, 9/11, the subprime crash, huge crippling student debt, the rise of Trump. We saw Bernie's campaign. So this is a generation that, whether it likes it or not, or wants to or not, has to get good at institution building really fast. Otherwise, there won't be any institutions for their future.
But what are their institutions? What are the institutions they're going to build? In what's your thought process on that? Because they're a very disparate group, as you point out. A lot of people say millennials. They're not. There's a whole group. There's the destroyers, the creators, and then there's the whole group who opt out in the middle. And it's very difficult to put these as a cohesive force.
Exactly. And a couple of thoughts there. First, I think they're truly given a bad rap by boomers who project their own sort of dark traits onto them. Like boomers like to pretend that millennials are entitled little brats. They're not. They're like the first generation shaped by serious wars in quite a while. Like, I mean, who fought Iraq? Who fought Afghanistan? These are millennial soldiers. They've been shaped by war. They've been shaped by economic turmoil. Yes, they grew up in slightly privileged 90s circumstances, but fundamentally they've had a very, very tough life coming of age. It costs like, 4 or 5 times more their typical annual income to buy a house than their parents did. So it does feel hypocritical when their parents say things like, oh, when I was your age, I'd already, gotten a job and I had bought my house and blah, blah, blah. It's, yeah, your house was worth 1 year's salary, right? So that's just my little defense of millennials. But you're right, there's a huge variety. You've got millennials in the Middle East who are, who were part of leading the Arab Spring. You've got millennials who are going to like face the brunt of the European debt crisis and how to recover from that. You've got all these kids in Southeast Asia and parts of Africa who are sort of coming of age with smartphones. And of course, the US is the place where people pay most attention to the US American millennial as sort of the archetype. But even there, you have a lot of variation. Yes, you've got sort of these precious snowflake types who seem to constantly be on Instagram, preening and presenting themselves. But you've also got people who've built enormous new institutions already. Like take WordPress, the blogging platform. I use it. I'm almost 42 now, and my entire life lives off this platform built by a millennial who's probably a decade younger than me, Matt Mullenweg, right? And WordPress runs about I think it's like close to 20% of the internet's websites today. Wow. That's an institution. Wow. That's a true institution. Kickstarter is an institution. Wikipedia is an institution. All these things. It's just that when older generations think of what constitutes an institution, they have this notion of like big ivy-covered buildings and historical traditions. So they don't recognize these new institutions taking shape. But at the same time, the existing institutional tradition is not going to go away, because this is one thing that has been a big insight for me in my Breaking Smart Season 2 research, which is institutions have vastly more inertia and longevity than things like businesses. Take, for example, the German bureaucracy, which is in many ways considered the archetype of modern centralized states and modern bureaucracies. That was developed towards the end of the 18th century, and it actually still exists. It lasted through 2 world wars. It lasted through a fascist Hitler era. It lasted through a social democrat kind of era, and it's now facing Syrian refugees and so forth. So the German bureaucracy, much as we might like to vilify bureaucracies, is an institution that has survived for several hundred years. And the internet and internet-based institutions are not going to like displace them and create this brave new anarchy out of like, blank canvas. It's going to be, how are these institutions going to evolve? And you can go elsewhere, right? I mean, the Catholic Church is like a 2,000-year-old institution. That's also going to change. It's not going to go away anytime soon. So yeah, millennials are going to do a lot of institutional creative destruction, and they're good at it.
There's a couple of observations on that. Firstly, is I've noted that the companies like Google and Facebook are not what everybody thinks they are. They're actually data companies, and data is the new oil. It's almost a repeat of what the oil companies did, how they fought the government, that whole thing about the Apple phone, it had nothing to do with that case. It was about who owns the data, much as we had with the oil barons with who owns the oil. So you notice that's clearly an institution building in a whole business that we didn't know existed, which was data ownership. Yep. Control of data is like controlling water supply and oil supply. The world needs it now. We're now so reliant on that. The other thing that I've noted is I think the millennial generation has been slow, but is working on reinvention of the financial system. That is the biggest one of all that needed changing. And I know you're a big fan of blockchain technology as well, and what's going on there. I just think that is probably one of the biggest changes we're going to see.
Yeah, so there's a couple of very interesting threads there. So data and finance are almost like 2 parallel threads. So to talk about blockchain first, the recent, I don't know if you were following the DAO hack, that was kind of a very interesting and revealing coming of age moment, because that experiment, it was slightly shoddily built, but it had certain utopian sensibilities behind it. And a lot of blockchain thinking, you do see a certain amount of utopian sensibilities. It's the people who get attracted to blockchain as a way of reinventing the whole world are the same people who kind of dream about finding a desert island somewhere and rebuilding society from scratch on John Galt principles.
That's right. There's a libertarian element.
Exactly.
To that.
And the key part of that is not so much the libertarian philosophy, but this sort of strong urge to have like kind of a political and cultural amnesia and forget and wipe out everything that came before. And that I don't think is going to happen with anything. Yes, as the Republican Party kind of melts down and traditional religiously focused conservatism starts to sort of, go into its reactionary tail phase and libertarianism rises, maybe we'll see like a vast reordering of the political order where maybe in the US you have the Democrats emerging as like a more Europe-style social democrat political force. Maybe the Libertarian Party grows up a little bit, and sort of goes mainstream and sort of acknowledges its own history and sort of becomes part of the historical tradition. And that's where a lot of sort of somewhat precious things come out of, like, the love for manifestos. Like I I love making fun of people who love manifestos. It's like, to me,
Yeah, but you're a cynical Generation Xer like me.
it's partly cynicism of Generation X, but partly it's like people forget how much the inertia of history shapes how you even think about your new utopias. And so I do make fun of that. But on the other hand, data, the other thread you brought up, what is data other than sort of just a new way of just relating to history? Like Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, he had a very smart quote that history is just all the data we have so far, which is literally true. And if you look at sort of some of the other technologies that are coming up alongside blockchain, they are very interesting to think about in relation to data. So for example, yes, these big platform companies like Google and Facebook, they're like collecting, exabytes of data. But until about a decade ago, we didn't know what to do with it. Like the NSA still has like piles of drone data it can't like actually do anything with. But deep learning, which is a big new trend coming up, that's almost from the ground up a technology designed to like consume and process huge amounts of data. Like the more data you can feed it, the better. There's this wonderful paper by people at Google. It's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Data. That it kind of sparked the big data movement. And the premise there is that it's better to have more data and simpler algorithms than to have complex algorithms and less data. And this has been behind lots of successes already, like automated machine translation, biometrics. Computers are already better at recognizing faces on like video cameras. So as they get better and better and start doing more and more things, this data is going to actually go from being sort of a dead, frozen asset that's depreciating in value, sitting on servers, to a live, appreciating asset that almost has like a return rate, an interest rate applied to it based on how much intelligence you're applying to it. And it's not just big data technologies and deep learning technologies, it's other things like virtual reality. Like virtual reality and augmented reality. Think of something like a corporation's institutional memory. Right now, when we think of a corporation's institutional memory, we are talking about like, maybe 10 years of data warehouses. Maybe going back another 30, 40 years, you have like microfilm, microfiche. And if it's a really old company or institution, like say JP Morgan, with a couple of 100 years of history behind it, well, 125 or whatever at this point, the oldest records will be in the form of like handwritten paper letters and things like that. But we now have the technology where you could sort of take like a largish company like Google, put cameras everywhere, record everything that goes on. And you could actually create like an institutional eidetic memory where a new employee joining in say 2035 can say, all right, I need to get caught up on the history of Google and all the important things that have happened, hit rewind, and I can actually be in the room where Larry Page made this big decision and understand the context of how that evolved. That's becoming possible because it's, as somebody, I forget who it was, I think it was Dyson, who defined big data as it's big data when it's cheaper to store data than to decide what to do with it. And processing in Moore's law terms, that's already in sort of its diminishing returns, but storage and memory are still going on really fast cost decline curves, and it's going to get cheaper and cheaper to store more and more and more data. And at some point, it'll be like you will have this eidetic prosthetic memory of histories of institutions and individuals. Like DARPA ran a project about 10 years back called, I think it was called LifeLog or something, which was to explore technology to log everything in your life. If you look at sort of what children in high school or undergrad are taught is the scientific method, that's really a kind of proceduralized, bureaucratized version of science that really benefits certain institutions like funding agencies that need a certain amount of legibility. They need clear metrics like impact factor, citations, what to fund. So it's set up for that. It has nothing to do with science in the spirit of the way it's done. Now, if you look at the philosophy of science and the most
scientific philosophy, I think, is what's missing.
I think it does exist, and the thing is, it's been subverted for a while. So there's been sort of a tradition of it goes back to like Bacon and the early idea of hypothesis testing. Then you had people like Thomas Kuhn with his structure of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts and evolutionary versus revolutionary science. And there's this philosopher named Paul Feyerabend. I think he died about a decade ago, who wrote this book called Against Method, where his claim was, if you look back in the history of all the great science, there is no such thing as a scientific method. It's methodological anarchy, and whatever works, works. But that isn't to say that just because there's no method, that it's the same as like, religion or superstition, because you have to be careful there, because things, especially when you're talking about like autism and vaccines, you end up like opening the door to a lot of undisciplined thinking. So what I think does exist is something you could call a scientific sensibility, and I've written about this, and it's really just a sort of dispassionate, mindful approach to looking at reality around you, rather than with all sorts of motivated biases and preconceived notions. And that's almost intellectual discipline.
We have the same in economics. Is behavioral economics is the new format where, again, you're not just saying, well, this is how it is. It's model based. It's not.
Yeah, but I would be a little wary of putting too much trust in things like behavioral economics, because remember, the scientific method in its original form also started that way, as people getting excited about certain, systematic things that seem to be true. And now you're kind of seeing the later stage of behavioral economics, and sort of this, what I think of has turned into a bias hunting game. It's now all those people who used to cargo cult old kinds of scientific methods are now cargo culting bias hunting. And now you've got these clueless people who are not mindful at all, don't understand foundations of probability and epistemology, and they're going around like, haha, you have confirmation bias, haha, you have, solution aversion. And that's in its own way equally stupid. But where I think we are making significant progress, especially in relation to the sort of data revolution, is just a lot more scrutiny and openness. Like now, slowly the norm is evolving that if you use code to do some analysis, you should be publishing that code open source. If you use a data set to reach certain conclusions, you should be releasing that data set. Because what helps is not any particular improved method, whether it's probability or whatever your favorite is, but a multiplicity of perspectives and a diversity of approaches to understanding reality. And you can only do that when there's a culture of like openness and sharing. And this is what you need to separate rigorous disciplined thinking from bullshit. Because one of the things cheap storage and spread of data does is that it accelerates bullshit faster than it accelerates knowledge. Like there's this meme popular in the internet circles I hang out in called Brandolini's Law. I don't know if you've heard it.
No.
It says it takes 10 times the effort to refute bullshit as it takes to create it. And this is in the same spirit as a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. It's that principle for the modern age. But bullshit is a more pernicious thing than straight out lying. Are you familiar with Harry Frankfurt's essay on bullshit?
No.
So I recommend it. It's one of my
Sounds
top recommendations. So bullshit is somewhat different from lying. Lying is a conscious and sort of focused act of, you think you know what the truth is and you want to mislead somebody else, so you make up a falsehood and mislead them. Bullshitting, according to this brilliant article, is when you're indifferent to the truth or falsity of what you're saying and you just want to achieve an emotional impact or affect. And Donald Trump is, of course, the classic example. It's not so much that he lies, but that he's completely indifferent to the truth. He will push whatever button it takes to get the crowd riled up, and he does not actually care whether what he's saying is true or false. So he's not a liar as much as a bullshitter. And the internet and its data technologies are bullshit acceleration media. And if you don't get really disciplined and thoughtful, and by the way, millennials again are great at this. Like people again like to take shots at them, but who are the people sending around like unverified bullshit emails? Typically, it's retired boomers who are like, "Oh, did you hear this?"
Yeah, my parents.
Exactly. But millennials, they have what I call like a brilliant Snopes. So Snopes.com, the debunking site. Like I actually have poor instincts. When I see a story, I often get taken in by like fake news or like a bullshit opinion, but typically it's going to be a younger person than me who points out that, yeah, I looked at that and that's bullshit. And this is sort of an arms race between bullshit and intelligence that's going to drive how the scientific method evolves in an age of, ubiquitous data.
Yeah, I mean, the Human Genome Project is the great open source project of our time, and maybe one of the most important things. What we look at in terms of Google or the things that have happened in Silicon Valley may be insignificant compared to the Human Genome Project and the idea of mass science and data. But the problem is, as you say, it's easy to pull bullshit out of that.
Yeah, but things like the genome actually have a built-in bullshit threshold. It takes a certain amount of competence to even get in the game and start. So take, for example, CRISPR. Are you familiar with CRISPR?
No.
Oh, CRISPR is something that everybody should be paying a lot of attention to.
Right.
It's a genomics technology that basically is going to... It's sort of a technology based on like little fragments of DNA that can be programmed to resequence genomes. Right. So it's this really accessible, democratized technology that basically anybody can use. You can order certain gene sequences from like online cloud sources, get them and start doing synthetic biology in your little lab. So basically the original Human Genome Project cost millions and millions of dollars. The rate of cost decline in sequencing a genome has actually been faster than Moore's law. Many people don't realize this. It's faster than Moore's law. So right now, 23andMe gives you a basic genomic profile for $99. It's going to fall even lower. But more importantly, that's just sort of the read-only version of genomics, where you can read your genome and sort of make assessments of it. Now we're getting into the read-write phase of genomics, and CRISPR is the right part. It allows you to sort of make up your own genes. Lots of young people are, especially in Oakland and Berkeley, the East Bay part of Silicon Valley, there's a booming synthetic biology sort of scene developing, and this is going to be, almost the next computer revolution.
And how are people thinking through there's a big, you stumble across the elephant of morality in that room and you have to dance around it. What's the thinking around what is right and what's wrong? Does it matter? Or are we looking at the wrong definitional terms?
So this is where I think I end up a somewhat partisan on one side, where honestly, I think all the hand-wringing about the morality and ethics does not matter. And it's because the world is not a single unified dictatorship where people with different perspectives on the ethics aspect can come in a big UN parliament and decide that, oh, cloning humans is bad, genetically modifying mosquitoes to get rid of the Zika virus is good. It doesn't happen like that. That's not how technological morality gets decided. What happens is you've got millions of hacker teams all over the world, China, the US, India. As these costs drop and it takes, say, $1,000 to experiment with a new yeast molecule or something like that, you don't have a single global conversation on what's moral and what's ethical. You have thousands of teams everywhere individually deciding what's moral and ethical, and they're all going to come to divergent conclusions. And what is important is that you have a political order that allows there to be a generative conversation across this plurality of moral stances.
You'll get morality arbitrage, right? So
yeah, exactly. So if one jurisdiction says we are going to ban human cloning, some country is going to find an advantage in human cloning. I think China is already racing towards that. And it's almost like a moot point. It's like pointless moral posturing, because once the genie is out, whoever has sort of the morality that allows for the most generative exploration of that technology or science is going to be the one that wins the game.
So doesn't that automatically change the political process? I'm just thinking this through, towards a libertarian-based society, because it's almost futile to try and stop the individuality of all of these various differences in morality.
Absolutely, and it's already happening, right? I mean,
is this the fragmentation of the political system we're seeing, partly? Exactly,
and yes, there are dangerous things to it, and people like to refer to nuclear technology as an example of a sort of really powerful and potentially dangerous technology that was really controlled by a very small group of people who had access and the capital and military structure to deal with it. And yes, we didn't blow the world up, and we did invent nuclear technology, and that may be central to solving climate change. So nuclear technology was a very powerful and dangerous technology with good and bad sides that had moral and ethical stewardship in a particular authoritarian model. It was like to handle nuclear technology wisely, we had to have hierarchical, patriarchal governments around the world doing things a certain way. That's not going to be an option here. Things are just too cheap. Things are just too accessible and available. 3D printing, the TSA recently found a 3D printed gun in a piece of online luggage. We're going to have to deal with this new world, and that means inventing new forms of bottom-up empowering morality that doesn't rely on the wisdom of a few patriarchal figures sitting together in the UN Security Council. We are going to need to sort of almost raise the floor of ethical sophistication across the board.
But how the hell do we do that? I mean, that's an easy thing to say, incredibly difficult to do, because you're changing the political process entirely.
I don't think we are. I think it's back to the fundamental values of liberal democracies, because that's what liberal democracy is when it works, which is a sort of generative pluralism. That's the phrase I use. A generative pluralism where these ideologies can sort of peacefully hammer these things out instead of mounting coups and revolutions to sort of displace each other. And this is why I think sort of the wave of conservative reactionary populism sweeping the world is a really dangerous thing, because it's creating an environment that sort of romanticizes and nostalgically wants to head back towards, an authoritarian patriarchal world order where a few people have the power. But that's not going to matter. If that's the way you want to run the things, the agency is still going to be at the grassroots level.
It's also because people feel out of control of the rapid change in society, in the structure of society, and globalization is, I think, the key thing that nobody really gets. And I concern myself that trumped onto something which is very powerful, which is the problems that globalization have had. And it will have to probably go in reverse in some respects to give people the level of comfort that they need, because that's what they're thrashing out against.
Yep. There's a couple of angles there. I was just talking about this in another interview. So globalization, yes, it has always been a cyclic phenomenon since it started, and I would trace the beginnings to the early Islamic age, actually. There have been waves and waves. And there's a guy Professor Emeritus at Wharton who studies this, Stephen Kobrin, who's written about cycles. And the last time there was sort of a recession in globalization was just in the run-up to World War I.
That's right.
And these recessions in globalization sort of also seem to coincide with recessions in democracy. That's another phrase that's come up. Francis Fukuyama, who's a very solid commentator on the nature of democracy, he came up with this end of history argument. He talks about how we are in a democratic recession right now. So both globalization and democracy are a little bit in recession, but that should not blind us to the fact that there is a secular signal there where within this sort of cyclic aspect of globalization, there's this irreversible trend of increasing global integration that you cannot sort of retreat from.
It's impossible. Technology is now broken. It's impossible for that not to go away, but we need to find the way that people can engage in it without it being too destructive for them as an individual.
And that's where I think Trump represents the voice of a sentiment that, if there is a legitimate part to it, it's this reaction against not cosmopolitanism itself, but a particular flavor of it. Like what passes for cosmopolitanism now is really the Davos conversation. And I've been sort of critical about sort of the Davos way of thinking about globalization for a while now, in private and in some public conversations. But Davos is not globalization. Davos is not cosmopolitanism. That's the 1%.
That's elitism.
Yeah, it's getting together in Switzerland and talking about the world. So I've been sort of noodling with this phrase in my head of something called blue collar cosmopolitanism or middle class cosmopolitanism. So the sort of at least the narrative around the Trump campaign, the statistics seem to reveal a different picture. But the narrative is that it's sort of an expression of blue collar nationalism, so to speak. So the people who are attached to the social order that's going away, that's from an era where industrial bases were built up at a nation state level, and industrial competitiveness was sort of analyzed in units of nations. So the American industrial base and the American blue collar class versus the British versus the Chinese versus the Mexican. So it was a very nation state way of thinking about the blue collar labor class. So that's now become cosmopolitan, and you have to realize that there is now such a thing as a blue collar cosmopolitan class. You've got migrant workers from India and Southeast Asia flooding into Middle East on vast construction projects. The global shipping industry is entirely staffed by
Filipinos.
Exactly.
And Indians.
And
yeah.
Indians and Pakistanis. So there's this whole sort of a working class layer of cosmopolitanism, and they're a political actor too, with a voice and leverage and agency that can work.
Is that cosmopolitanism or is that labour arbitrage? Or are they the same thing?
It's they're two threads of the same thing, right? I mean, one aspect of it is, of course, it's labor arbitrage, and they're going there because it's beneficial to all parties. At another level is global economic integration. Like global remittances are like a huge part of like financial flows, and that's something that it's like small amounts flowing in like little trickles, but together they constitute trillions of dollars. So that's the financial story, but it's also a sort of story of culture, and this is something I think the finance world doesn't recognize as well. But when you've got like Texan oil workers going and working in the Middle East, or Indian workers in the Middle East, there is actual cultural interaction and interchange going on, and going a little higher up the hierarchy. I mean, every major cosmopolitan city in the world now, like take Brexit, for example. Some people have framed it as a people of London versus Little England, and almost as if the only people who matter are the powerful elites in the London banking sector versus these left behind people in Little England. That's not true. London's cosmopolitan scene also depends on vast numbers of people working in all the international restaurants. Like, why are there restaurants from every possible culture in every major city in the world? It's because there's this other globalized class, right?
Yeah.
There's also a cosmopolitan middle class. There's all these people working for multinationals shuttling between the US and China. That's an example I like to use. Like, there's an Asia-America sort of bipole thing that runs the global semiconductor industry. This is not run by like extremely wealthy elites in Davos. This is run by engineers and middle managers shuttling back and forth, sorting out issues, making sure that chips get designed and built correctly. That's the middle class of cosmopolitanism. And the secular signal, like I said, yes, there's a democratic recession and there's a globalization recession, but the secular signal, the increasing global integration, yes, the financial component is the one that has proceeded the farthest and will kind of see the biggest backsliding, perhaps. But these other things, they're perhaps way more important because they're on the fundamentals level, right? There's now a global technocrat class, there's a global engineer class, there's a global class of people who know how to build chips, for example. That's not a few engineers in one country competing with a few engineers in another country. It's not Cold War. It's like a global cosmopolitan set. And when you need to build a next bleeding edge chip, if there's maybe only a dozen people in the world who can architect and design that chip, you're going to drag them from all over the world and assemble a team where it matters, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a definite trend towards clustering that we've seen. I mean, it happens very much in the West Coast. It happens in New York. It happens in London. It happens in Mumbai. It happens all over the place. We get clustering of smart people to come around the great universities. There's a lot of clustering. So, with regards to globalization, where do you think this process is going to lead to? Because it's a complicated situation right now where clearly globalization is changing, but globalization also is increasing. What's your view on globalization going forwards?
I'm very bullish on it in the sort of medium to long term. In the short term, yes, there's going to be like, reactionary tightening of borders and so forth. But the reason I'm sort of very bullish on it is that it's sort of percolating down from like the elite, like I said, to the middle and blue collar class in more and more powerful ways. A couple of indicators of that. One is, something like airline travel. Like I believe in 2012, there were over 1 billion tourist arrivals across borders worldwide. and of course, a lot of those people travel a lot more, so it's not like a billion people traveled, but that's astounding. The sheer number of people traveling, it's still less than, I think 3% of the world is likely to ever leave their home country, but it's still like, from that small base, it's exploding. And when you throw in the fact that virtual reality and just video conferencing are becoming powerful media, like I run this conference in the Bay Area called Refactor Camp. I've done it for 4 years. We did it face to face and at a venue in the Bay Area for 4 years. This year, for the first time, we used video conference. We had people calling in from Australia, China, the UK, and it was like 40 people. It was like sitting in a room together. That's globalization happening at the middle class level. Pokemon Go is a phenomenon. You go onto online fora, you have like young students from all over the world with not a penny to their name, talking and interacting, forming software teams. I was teaching at this boot camp called Exosphere down in Chile for people wanting to get into startup life. Lots of people of all ages coming in from all around the world, trying to learn some hacker skills. So these are very, very positive signs on a couple of levels. It's that people, if you go back a couple of centuries, the only people who had exposure to people even beyond their own village or town, let alone people from around the world, were these sort of members of tiny classes like diplomats and traders and maybe a few military generals. Now you're seeing more and more people shaped, their sensibilities, the political and cultural sensibilities shaped by globalization. There are entire towns with so many people in sort of an expat traveling loop that their whole town has become cosmopolitan, right? Not just big cities like New York or London, small towns. Like my parents are now retired in a small town called Coimbatore in South India. That's flush with Gulf money, and a huge amount of the cultural evolution of Coimbatore has been, interaction with the Middle East through financial flows. And you see this sort of at an everyday level. Like at Xerox, I worked with outsourcing teams. Now, as a single individual consultant, as a one-person business, a couple of my clients in healthcare, for example, they're dealing with globalization issues and regulatory arbitrage across the Middle East, Canada, and the US. So it's like globalization isn't this abstract thing that only people at the UN and Davos are concerned with. Now it's this sort of reality in the middleware and base labor economy levels. And the beautiful thing about that is that the more that happens, the more people become socially liberal and sort of appreciative of the value of diversity. This is actually a robust effect. A friend of mine, he was an early founder of couch surfing. This is that startup that allows people to just live in people's couches. And one of the robust effects they discovered was that couch surfing reliably turned conservatives liberal. Just the simple fact of living with people who are different from you broadens and expands your mind. And this used to be true even in the elites. Like back in the day, before Congress was so polarized in the US, I heard this, I don't know how true it is, congressmen and women would actually share lodgings in Washington, D.C. when Congress was in session and when they were not back in their states. And this very act of like living together, getting up in the morning, brushing your teeth together, that kind of contact sort of brings people together and helps them appreciate other points of view very well. And you see this like recent Gallup data on Trump voters, for example. A robust indicator is that they live in particularly sort of homogeneous enclaves of white voters. That's a robust effect. Like if you happen to live in an extraordinarily dominantly white area, there's a greater chance you'll vote for Trump. So this idea that exposure to cosmopolitanism and diversity is a positive feedback loop that makes you appreciate it more, make you want it more. Like I have friends of all backgrounds who now seriously believe that they cannot ever go back to the kind of homogenous little culture bubbles they came from in small towns.
No, I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that part of the globalization process is fantastic. It creates a more liberal attitude amongst people, their tolerances for each other, different cultures, how they work together. You create magic when you can put different people from different aspects together, whether they're physically or via technology. But there's the other dark side of globalization, which is as society is transitioning from a manufacturing-based society and you have global labor arbitrage, what it really did was destroy huge amounts of people's well-being. The real average hourly wages has collapsed across the entire Western world, and people don't know why they're angry. But this is why they're angry. It's because somebody else got all of their jobs, and it's not the immigrants who got their jobs. It's the companies producing goods elsewhere. And I know you enjoy reading. There's a fantastic interview and a book by a guy called James Goldsmith. James Goldsmith was one of the most famous kind of financiers of the 80s. He wrote, there's a book written about him called Billionaire, and he was an amazing guy and whip sharp. And he did an interview with Charlie Rose about globalization ahead of the WTO agreement in 1996, where he laid out the case of exactly what is about to happen, how politics is going to change because of it, and how it was a mistake to not have a world with tariffs. And he's a pure capitalist, and it's a terrible thing to mention the word tariffs, and I've written some articles about it recently, and people are like, you can't mention the T word. I'm like, well, you can, because if you look what happened, it's great to have globalization across culture, but globalization needs to be a managed process, otherwise it breaks society. And he wrote a book called The Trap, and you should read it. It's really, really fascinating.
There's definitely merits to that argument. And a couple of points on that. One is, I don't think the data is that clear yet. Like the Gallup poll I just mentioned, apparently this base for support for Trump is not actually the constituency that's been hurt most by this sort of shift in manufacturing.
No, but they were, as you talked about before, they were part of that old establishment way of doing things. You have the job for life, and they're the people they know something is broken.
Exactly, and they're concerned for their children's future and so forth. So yes, their social order is crumbling, and the same thing is true in the Brexit case as well. There's this sort of, it's hard to separate the thread of how much is genuine sort of economic pain that's sort of repressed, how much of it is manifesting as racial suspicion or something like that. So it's a very complicated thing that's going to sustain like 10 PhDs in the next decade. We'll sort of get the picture clear in the next 10 years. But what can we sort of robustly conclude right now at this very preliminary stage where there's like 10 times more bullshit than signal about what's happening right now? So as far as things like tariffs go, I tend to be very strongly on the other side, which is, yes, you can't, not extreme in the sense of the libertarian idea of open borders. I think that would be anarchy. And I'm not yet an anarchist. I may be one in the future. But as far as you can go without like totally breaking the system, like push it as hard, as fast as you can. That tends to be my sort of bias. And the reason is actually not cultural, it's actually economic. If you look at what's happening and why all these things are happening, it's because the global economy is getting rebalanced as a function of population and sort of almost per capita modulo education levels. Like before the colonial era, India and China both had somewhere between 20 to 25% of world GDP. I think trade was like less than 2% or something like that. And we've seen what that's done. And there's this massive imbalance that has come in that's slowly leveling back. And a lot of people have sort of commented on this. So as that happens, that's a really, really powerful economic force. And if you try to artificially arrest it, it's actually going to break things even quicker.
Yeah, but the law of unintended consequences is where the dangerous element lies. And the dangerous element from this was the fact that the rich got super rich, basically because you can produce everything at a lower cost elsewhere, and they didn't have to pay their workers. So the balance between labour and capital got pulled to extremes.
Yes, but this has happened before, right? I mean,
and it always ends baddy.
That's where I disagree with you. I don't think it ends badly. Like this goes back to the first Luddites, then the 1820s textile industry in the UK, 1860s, 1870s as the big robber baron corporations came online.
But unionism came out. There was huge changes. So the shift of power changed dramatically from the elite back to the average guy.
Agreed. So there were institutional reactions, new kinds of valuable institutions emerged. The labor movement was very valuable in what it did across 50 to 70 years. So those things will happen and will continue to happen. I just happen to think that erecting tariff barriers again is actually going to make the problem worse, not better. So the specific institutional form to check against, say, the overextended phase of neoliberalism, that specific institutional form, we still have to kind of work it out. But yes, there will be an institutional reaction. But the part that I think we can robustly say is not true is this idea that there's something special about robots and software that makes humans completely obsolete, in the sense of, there's nothing for humans left to do. I mean, the same arguments have been trotted out each time. Like agriculture at some point was 99% of the GDP. Now in developed countries, it's like 4 to 5%. That does not mean 96% are sitting around doing nothing. Initially, they became part of the industrial economy, then the service economy. Now you've got like an industry worth tens of billions of dollars just creating video games, right? So people find new wants and needs to fulfill and create new industries to fulfill those needs. And this is a point that goes back to Keynes in his article, Future Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, and then Milton Friedman wrote about this as well. People always have there's no limit to wants and needs. And this is a point where I initially came from a position of skepticism, just like you. But one of the sort of changes in mind for me, talking to Mark Andreessen a lot during Breaking Smart, is that forced me to look at the data of history. And I had to agree that each time you think human beings are obsolete, they just invent a huge set of new industries to make themselves valuable again.
That's right. Yeah, and I actually believe that. And one of the things you've written about in your writings is about the kind of Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week culture of people now have realised that there's the societal restrictions of establishment and how things were in the past have now changed, and they can go and create new things, and you can become a travel advisor living in Southeast Asia, and you're creating a role that was never there before, that robots will not do certain things. And humans are incredibly ingenious.
Humans are restless.
They are.
There's this great book called Satisfaction by Gregory Burns, which talks about how humans have this satisfaction drive and they keep looking for the next achievement. There's another recommendation from Mark Andreessen, by the way. He's like thrown so much material at me in the last couple of years. Anyway, so humans are restless, so they will always find ways to occupy themselves. And this idea of like a 4-hour work week, it sort of fails not because you can do it actually. If you're smart enough, you could probably put together a lifestyle where you're really only working for 4 hours. But humans actually want to work more, and they want that work to matter. They don't like, there's this phenomenon, have you read this article by David Graeber called On Bullshit Jobs? So just like there's bullshit in rhetoric and discourses, there's this idea of bullshit jobs, where jobs that don't need to be done, people creating work for each other, moving paper around, even this is valuable. Like France has an entire sort of welfare economy based on like giving people a sense of dignity by literally creating these fake companies for people to pretend to work in. You've got people who prefer to be the human cogs of a job that should be automated and could be automated, where they're adding no value. But even if you offer them the choice between you can continue to work or here take an equivalent in pay and go retire, people will often choose to continue to work because
Japan,
it's identity, right?
Japan, as the workforce got holed out over time, they just did nothing. It was a window job.
Exactly, and those people had like massive psychological problems and things like that. And even a meaningless job like the Japanese like to invent, like I believe they have people devoted to walking up and down malls, polishing the banisters of the escalators. To me, that's a bullshit job. Right? It doesn't need to be done that frequently. We are not OCD germphobes. But hey, it gives somebody a sense of dignity and purpose. But wouldn't it be so much better if that person were doing something that was not bullshit? And that's something that we're slowly discovering with the digital economy. Like an example that just crossed my radar yesterday was the way the Chinese prepare for the Olympics. There's this brutal regimen of like finding little kids at age 3 or 4, putting them through this like almost factory farming torture process, which produces like, yes, a crop of great elite athletes who win a crop of medals at every Olympics, but it also wastes so much human potential because 99% of those people are not going to make Olympic grade. They're going to be falling off that sports wagon. They don't have an education. They don't have any other skills. And the story I read had examples of like gymnasts who didn't make the Chinese gymnastics team now panhandling in Beijing subways. And that to me is a waste of human potential.
It's very interesting. I find it interesting how China and India have addressed this differently because, as you say, the Chinese, they do it with these, for the greater good of China, they get all of these athletes to go through this process. In India, the same thing's done about education. university. It's the same, but it's society that does it in India. You're kind of forced into getting into the best university and getting the best outcome, as long as you're a doctor or somebody, it's very interesting. I think India, in the end, they'll have done themselves a lot of favour by not the wasteful use of human capital, which is what China did. It was good for a period of time, but in the end it's wasteful.
India has fortunately avoided some patterns of wasting human potential, but it has
a ton of others.
very creatively discovered a whole bunch of other patterns, exactly. But going back to my sort of fundamental faith in liberal democracy and a very robust sort of empowerment and agency at the lowest level you can get it to. This has happened before, like Britain versus France in the 17th century, I believe, under Jean-Baptiste Colbert versus the British. For a while, the French actually pulled ahead of the British in naval technology because of massive top-down effort. But then they fell back and Britain became the dominant naval power of the colonial era. Similar things happen with India versus China. Similar sized countries in population terms. One is democratic, where it's messy and horribly painful to get anything done.
I tried closing my Indian bank account. 9 months so far to change it. So I still can't close it.
Yes, that is India for you. And there's a million such examples. And some of it is funny, some of it is terrible. Take the highway system. It's atrocious and it's actually dangerous. India has the highest traffic accident rate per mile, and that's sad. You don't want people dying in traffic accidents. Yeah, that's such a waste of human potential. But I think fundamentally, across all these sort of topics we've talked about, the reason I'm sort of a believer in liberal democracy is that it creates these robust sort of secular trends that eventually win out over these big volatilities. And one way I like to capture that, and this connects to our conversation of neoliberalism has gone to an extreme and what are the institutional reactions. There's this belief in grassroots democracy and trickle-down economics. That's kind of been the formula for Reagan-Thatcherism for the last 35 years. I believe that's exactly the wrong way around. It has to be trickle-down democracy and grassroots economics, where you need economic empowerment and agency. Give everybody a laptop, a smartphone, an internet connection, a credit card, get them all the tools that make them powerful economic actors in their own right, managing their own financial future. That's the grassroots component. And democracy, if you actually look at the history of how the world is slowly democratized, the work of Francis Fukuyama is excellent. He's written a 2-volume book, The Origins of Political Order and Political Decay. The reality is democracy has always been a trickle-down thing. It started with elites, the Magna Carta, people forget it was done by the barons. Usually democracy has gone by expanding the franchise, starting with the middle class and slowly expanding towards the poorer sections of society. So democracy needs powerful ideological and political leadership that sort of works hard to extend the franchise meaningfully over time. But economics can act much faster and create conditions where democratic institutions can thrive. And you do that by empowering economic agency. And you see this in a couple of other great books I'd recommend on this topic is The Dictator's Handbook by Bruno de Mesquita, and Why Nations Fail. And if you pair these two books with Fukuyama's books, the picture is absolutely clear. You need economic empowerment in the sense that libertarians talk about it. Yeah. Give everybody the power to create wealth, make things, not do bullshit work. Realize the potential.
When people do business, things work.
Yeah, exactly. And democracy is the sort of necessary and almost sufficient condition to make that wealth stay and take institutional form in healthy ways rather than unhealthy ways. And in a sense, that's kind of almost the moral underpinning of globalization with increasingly open borders and so forth. So that's part of why I kind of believe in globalization. It fits in with this thesis.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.